Hey, hello everybody out there in internet land and our voluminous crowd here at the third floor venue of the New Orleans Jazz Museum. My name is David Kunian, and we are here for the Kidori Memorial Author Book Talk interviews that we're doing all day today. We have, let's see, after this we've got Gwen Tompkins and Bob Cataliotti. We've got Allison Fensterstock and Dan Sharp, Jennifer Odell and T.R. Johnson, and then capping it off with Bob Cataliotti talking to Scott Billington. So a day full of interesting stories and anecdotes and things like that. So we are glad you can join us. My name is David Kunian. I'm the curator here at the New Orleans Jazz Museum, and I'm talking to Bentley Brown, who is the son of Frederick Brown, whose paintings we have on exhibit on the second floor downstairs. We'll talk a little bit about that exhibit and who Frederick Brown was and the nature of his work and things like that. So, Bentley, I can never remember. You're a professor at NYU?
At Fordham.
At Fordham, okay.
Yes.
I could not remember which school, but in New York City. So,
Yes.
I guess to start off, explain who your dad was and what he did.
So my father was really a multidisciplinary artist who moved to New York in the 1970s and really became a pioneering figure within the downtown creative scene, which was a really significant scene of creatives for two reasons. One, I mean, in thinking about our context of the Jazz Museum here, is that it was really one of the major sites for the development of free jazz, right, in the wake of Ornette Coleman's collective improvisation. And then in terms of sort of visual art, this was also the scene that kind of laid the groundwork for the beginning of contemporary art as we understand it. So my father was really one of the central figures within that scene, and I think really important to the work that he was doing is he helped to bridge the gap between sort of the free jazz musicians and the contemporary artists. And for my father's work, he was really mainly working in the mediums of painting, but also performance as well, which included jazz and sort of visual art. And most of my father's subjects had to do with jazz music.
And where was it? This was happening. Where was this happening again?
So this is happening in Soho, Manhattan, New York City. And this movement sort of begins in the late 1960s and takes us all the way to the beginning of the 1990s.
Okay. And am I right in saying that Soho in New York City back then did not really look like what it does now?
Absolutely, absolutely. And when we talk about kind of other important aspects of this movement is that it also, ironically, maybe laid the groundwork for its redevelopment, right? So back then, Soho was, to quote several people that I've spoken to and just throughout the years hearing about this, Soho was bombed out. It used to be called Hell's 100 Acres because there were fires everywhere.
Wow. Okay.
At this time, people talk about the Bronx is burning. I think many people have maybe heard that narrative. But this was also happening in Lower Manhattan, in Soho as well, where building owners were burning the buildings to collect insurance money. So these artists began setting up shop in what were these former manufacturing spaces. So, for example, my father had a 5,000 square foot loft. Ceilings are almost 20 feet high, right? Floor to ceiling windows. These were basically the best spaces that you could imagine for creating large scale art.
So you could create a lot of work and a lot of big work there.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, one thing that my work has sort of been thinking through is the way in which these spaces were so significant for many of these artists, and in particular black artists, to create space for themselves. These were really spaces where, you could really create whatever you could imagine, and I think that was really important, in particular for black artists who were being marginalized from the larger conversations of, like, say, popular music, or say, in the context of art, like the contemporary art scene. So this was a part of kind of the environment that my father was a part of and helping to kind of cultivate was these spaces for free imagination.
Well, it's funny because I know that idea from dealing with the, listening to the music from then of the loft jazz, and as you said, free jazz, the next step of kind of free jazz and avant-garde jazz of Ornette Coleman's space on Prince Street,
131 Prince Street.
on Prince Street, and Sam Rivers' loft, where all sorts of great recordings and performances were, and Rashid Ali's alley, Ali's alley, of other places where these kind of things were going on. So, how did your father interact with the musicians he was friends with and dealing with?
Right. So his interactions with the musicians really began in Chicago. So my father was originally from Chicago, from the south side of Chicago. And he grew up with a lot of kind of the younger generation of sort of the free jazz musicians. So maybe thinking about like groups like AACM, right? Which were sort of foundational groups for taking what Ornette did and sort of like putting that structure into organization that expanded beyond just music, right? So it included kind of community organization. It included theatrical performance in many ways, bringing in also sort of Sun Ra's influence, and maybe thinking about something like the Chicago Art Ensemble. Together, they were sort of creating these really organized platforms for this. So for my father's sake, he was really friends with a lot of these musicians in like high school. So he sort of kept close ties with them. Also, these were some of the few people that were like working in art as well, like in Chicago at this moment in time.
So they were music and art.
Sorry?
They were doing music and they were also working in the art world.
Right,
too.
right.
Okay.
Well, and just thinking about creatives, right? Like these were some of the few creatives that he had access to in that moment in time, right? So they really had a community in Chicago. And then, once those musicians went to New York, they were also talking to their people back in Chicago, which at that time, my father was back in Chicago, and saying, hey, you got to come to New York because there's a huge kind of explosion of music and art happening in this space and time. So that's really how my father began to interact with a lot of these musicians. And through them, he kind of expanded his network wider and wider and wider. And in fact, when he went to New York, he ended up living with Ornette Coleman. For an extended period of time. So that, again, further expanded his sort of, his like circles with the jazz musicians. I think that's a really interesting aspect of how, his New York story is that it really began with the musicians and not the artists. So that really placed him in a very unique position, I think, on one hand, to like sort of have music and in particular jazz really be at the center of his practice. But on the other hand, it really allowed him to be this sort of bridge between the contemporary art scene and the free jazz scene that was happening in New York at that time.
And what kinds of things? I mean, I know he was painting these guys, but what other kinds of interactions did he have? What were there performances? Were there live painting? What kind of and what kind of art was he doing with them?
Right. So this is also the period of time of what you might call happenings, right? And this is an idea that comes about through an artist named Alan Caprow, who sort of says everything can be art, right? But like musicians had already kind of been moving in that direction prior to that, and for Caprow, like he's looking at jazz music and saying like this is an inspiration for that. So, as these loft spaces are developing, they're kind of developing with this like modus operandi of happenings, in a sense. And Ornette Coleman, who sort of has this loft on Prince Street, which is one of the major sort of central focal points within the community at that time, right? He's consistently putting on these happenings, in a sense, but they're more, again, kind of directed towards the jazz influence that he had already been a part of, right, prior to Caprow's ideas. So he was just trying to find ways to expand jazz language into the visual, into the performative, right? So Ornette at this time was having like art exhibitions. He was having video performances too, and shout out to Brent Edwards, who's spoken about this quite extensively. But you know, Ornette was one of the first like people to have like the handheld sort of cameras. So he would film the performances, but also like change the dials in very crazy ways to like make like this kind of like early video art. And we're talking like 1974. This is very early, right? So with that kind of model of these happenings, right? My father sort of saw that and then wanted to take that idea then into his practice. So it began with a work called Be Aware in 1973. And in fact, actually, part of the reason why my father had come to New York was to employ Ornette for this performance. So imagine just this, that like my father, like 20, 25, 26, 27, doesn't know Ornette and is like, I'm going to go find Ornette Coleman and like tell him to make me a musical score for a play. Like, that was his vision. But this ends
Chutzpah.
up, right. So this ends up happening, right, with this work, Be Aware, which was really about trying to bring attention to the fact that there were all of these black artists working in these really avant-garde modes, but they weren't getting any attention.
Right.
So he was trying to bring attention to that. And really what it was a funeral for art. So it had Ornette, who did the composition, the Revolutionary Art Ensemble, who did the music. Joseph Jarman was like screaming or something in the street. And then, he had paid certain people, I'll just leave it at that, to block off the street with garbage trucks. And then he threw all the work into the garbage trucks and then had a funeral for the artwork. So it was this large performance with that.
That sounds great and sounds very 70s.
Right, yes, exactly.
In the best of ways.
In the best of ways.
That's the way things were done.
Exactly. So as he then had his space on Wooster Street, right, so 120 Wooster Street was his loft space that he got in 1974, so the following year, he started to formalize these performances even more. For example, there's a work called Portrait of an Artist, where Anthony Ramos, an early video artist, films my father painting, but then Anthony Braxton is playing live in the background. So it's about this drama of sort of the act of creation. Another performance, 1976, Stolen Moments, is sort of taking that even further, but then adding in dance as well. So these performances are sort of building on one another, but really jazz is the center building block. And I think a really important idea that really comes from someone like Ornette, right, that influences not only my father's approach to performance and the way in which he's incorporating jazz music, but is also really influencing the entire happenings movement as a whole, is this notion of collective improvisation. I think this is an idea that's very, very central to performance work in the mid-1960s through the 1970s. So it was all of these individuals through their multidisciplinary practices, right, through their individual practices, sort of working together towards this trajectory of creating the most avant-garde work that they can. So jazz was really this kind of like, both as a music and as a concept, right, was at the center of what my father was doing. He was really building around it, I think is the best way to kind of think about it.
I think it is kind of fitting that your dad and trying to do this idea of collective improvisation via art and music and combining it all has an exhibit here where New Orleans, collective improvisation, though different from what Ornette was doing, and still collective improvisation is the roots of all New Orleans jazz.
Right.
In a different way, but still that's how it was done around here, kind of thing. In the early days.
Right. Well, and even thinking about just Ornette's movement towards free jazz, right? I mean, if you're just thinking about it from a musicological sense, right? Like, what is he doing? He's ultimately going back to the roots of the blues, right? To then come forward.
Yeah.
Right. So he's actually going back to some of these ideas of collective improvisation that really are foundational in spaces like here in New Orleans, right? And then bringing that through. Ornette, I think he's from like Fort Worth, Texas, right? So he's thinking about some of these Deep South Delta collective improvisational practices, and then bringing that forward into kind of this movement into jazz. Yeah.
And there's a great, I don't know if you know this, there's a great story. Ornette got, Ornette met a couple of the Lasty brothers who were, New Orleans jazz guys and R&B guys here in 1949 or so, because he got stranded in Natchez because he was touring with somebody and they didn't like what he was playing. They like kicked him out of the band and threw a saxophone over the bluffs in Natchez and so Ornette didn't know quite what to do. So he somehow made his way to New Orleans. Like, oh yeah, Melvin and Walter, I remember those guys. So he comes down and he lives here with these guys in 1950 for about 6 months, and that's when he meets the Lasties. That's when he meets Alvin Batiste and Ellis Marsalis and all those folk, and hangs out before he goes, and then he comes back every so often. But some of his formation, I think some of his ideas of how he started to do that came from that time. He always said came from that time, among other things.
Yeah.
So I always think I think of what would Ornette Coleman have been like if he hadn't been around here.
Right.
But yeah, some of his in the early days of Ornette, before and that's how we met Ed Blackwell, who drummed for him, and Kid and all those.
He was a New Orleans name.
Yeah, he was a New Orleans guy, and then when the New Orleans Cats decided that they wanted to try and do something with All for One Records, and move to Los Angeles, some of the guys, the first guy they called was Ornette when they were out there, and that's how Ed Blackwell starts playing with him and Paul Bley and Don Cherry and Charlie Hayden. So anyway, a digression into the history of Ornette Coleman. So, your dad, he also ended up, he switched at some point in the future and started moving toward painting kind of blues musicians, right? Explain how that kind of came about and what his process was for that.
Right.
Some of those are downstairs.
Sure.
So.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, his early work was really characterized by this mostly completely abstract approach, right? Which is very much kind of in sync with what's happening, or in sync with a part of what's happening in that moment in time in New York. This is, in art historical terms, this is the period that we call the pluralist era, where you have all of these different art movements kind of happening at one time. So my father is really kind of, at this moment, entrenched in what we would call second or third generation abstract expressionism, completely abstract canvases. But he was really always interested in narrative. And I think the cohort within the cohort of second generation abstract expressionism that he was a part of were all very interested in, how do we bring narrative aspects into the work? And in particular, how do we bring narrative aspects into the work that sort of relate to foundational Black cultural practices? I think that was something my father was really interested in. So he then moves to this kind of more figurative, narrative storytelling approach with these kind of figures that are these quasi-humanoid figures. But then in the early 1980s, he begins to sort of think about how to kind of place figures within the wider canon of art history. And he starts with his friends. So many artists, when they're trying to think about portraits, where they start? They start with the people around them, right? One thing that he said that was really interesting, one of the first works that leads to this is a work called The Last Supper, where it's his own rendition of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. And one interesting thing he brought up was, who did Leonardo paint for that? Who sat for that, right? Which is an interesting thing that I don't think anybody thinks of. We're just they're there, right? So he looked at the people around him first, and of course, who are the people around him? Jazz musicians, right? So one of the two of the people in that work are Anthony Braxton, right, the saxophonist and composer, and James Jordan, also a saxophonist, but was the former manager of Ornette Coleman, right? So out from there, he then kind of looks towards the other individuals in the community who are creating this avant-garde music, right? But are not getting their due, right? So another early portrait is of Dewey Redman, right?
Oh, wow.
But it's also a very abstract portrait. So
Dewey Redman, tenor saxophone player for Ornette, Blue Note recording artist, and also from Texas. So.
Exactly. So he's sort of building this catalog of individuals who are first around him, right? Who are creating this really important music but aren't getting their due. And it takes him back to a memory from 1969 where he was in Europe at the time at the Copenhagen Blues Festival. And he runs into two people that he knew from his younger years. So he runs into Magic Sam and Earl Hooker, both blues musicians from the south side of Chicago. And he knew them from the south side of Chicago because my grandfather managed a juke joint in the south side and had a shoe shine station. So he knew like Etta James and Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf. He like knew all these people, right? Also, and I think we forget about this, and as we move through the history, is that a lot of these people worked in the steel mills, right? Like these people also had occupations beyond, being musicians, right? Because they had to pay the bills. So the steel mills, in many ways, they obviously created jobs, right? But they also created creative community as well. So my father knew these people from this day, and he runs into Earl Hooker and Magic Sam, and they say like, "Hey, Fred, they get to chatting, whatever. They say, "Hey, Fred, we live like awful lives. Like we just like."
I'm laughing, but it's not funny.
They like we drink all the time. We just like don't live healthy lives. Like we're not gonna be around for long, right? But who's gonna remember us? Right? Who's gonna people will remember our music, maybe, sure, but like who's gonna remember us, right? And they were like, yeah, you went to college, like you could write, you can write a book about us. And my father's thinking at the time, like I don't know, like 27 or so. He's thinking like, probably can't write a book, but I can paint, and I'll come back to this, and just sort of think about that. I could paint, and maybe I could paint you all, right? So he comes back to this memory like 15 years later, right? 20 years later. And that's what really begins this blues series. And so he starts with the people that are around him, and then he builds out to the history of jazz. And, when you think about portraiture, right, which is really a central genre within art history, and you think about, like, what does portraiture do? How does it function, right? Well, one of its main functions is to show that this person is important for X, Y, and Z reason. An example I give my students is like, the portrait of Queen Elizabeth I, right? Like, what does it tell us? Well, it tells us that she was wealthy and politically extremely powerful, right? So it says something about that individual's importance, right? And also puts that person into our consciousness of history. So my father's looking at that, and he's saying, these people, right? All these people who have worked on the music, right, should be understood as foundational figures, not only sort of in Black cultural history, not only in American cultural history, but in the history of Western culture. Yeah. And so that's kind of the impetus for this work that then leads to 250 jazz portraits between 1981 and 2012.
And are they all about the size of the ones downstairs? Are they smaller? Are they some bigger? Or is it all varied?
It's all varied.
Okay.
Like there's some works that are, like 2 feet by 2 feet, right? Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about the Dewey Redmond portraits, very small. But then there's other works that are like literally 20 feet long.
Right.
So it's like, but my father always said, like, no matter the size of the work, right, all of it should have the same impact. Mm-hmm. It should all hit you in that same way that the music does. Because also, I think one question that always comes up is like, okay, like, what are these portraits of? I mean, of course, they're portraits of the people, right? But what are these moments that he's choosing? Well, he's ultimately choosing these moments of the highest level of their performance. So they're actually portraits of performance. Mm-hmm. And they're also portraits of that kind of almost spiritual effervescence that happens in that moment of performance, that kind of almost out of body experience. Mm-hmm. And I think that really comes through in the works that you can see downstairs.
Didn't he also, when he was starting to move, toward painting more blues musicians, didn't he do a trip to the South and undertake a kind of study of the history Tell me about that.
Absolutely. So, my father was, and I mean, I guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, because here I am with the.
Right.
He was always very interested in history. So he was always reading and always kind of like doing his research, right? I think when a lot of people think about artists, and I mean, this isn't true for every artist. Like, every artist has their own approach. But I think when people think about artists, they sort of think like, oh, they just go in the studio and throw some paint around and then here it is, like, right? But there's a lot of work that goes into that, right? And so this research was really important. So for my father, like, he was always about, like, he had to be like spiritually involved in the work in order to complete it. So, this trip through the South was him sort of becoming, well, first coming to a full understanding of the roots of the music. So he takes this trip through the Mississippi Delta, and then ultimately ends up at the, what is the site of the American Blues Museum, which is in
Clarksdale.
Clarksdale,
Yeah.
yes, in Clarksdale.
Mississippi.
Right, Mississippi.
Yeah.
So that was a part of it, right? Was to kind of gain these stories along the way. So he kind of mapped it out, interviewed local legends along the way. There's this. Also, I should say that this was all filmed as well. Mm-hmm. So that portrait of an artist piece that I had mentioned earlier. So it turned from a single moment to an actually like 30-year project by Tony Ramos, where he does there's literally like 124 hours of footage.
Wow.
It's a massive project that he does. But this is a part of that series, right? Where they go together through the South and they interview all of these local legends to gain this like oral history of the origins of the blues, right? And to get, I think, like setting, environment, landscape, all of that, right? The multi-sensory aspects that come together to create the blues, right? Because, there's a work downstairs that speaks to this, right? It's the only abstract work,
right, in the whole exhibit.
In the whole exhibit. And one thing you'll notice about that work is that there's gravel in it, right? So there's like it's about the landscape. It's about the body, right? It's very corporal in a sense, but it's also about that environment. So my father goes through this trip to kind of get a sense of the environment and hear the story from the people that live it, right? Yeah. And not just people he met along the way, but also people who live it in this like space of origin, right? Because as blues moves out, it develops into these different genres within it, right? But there's something about the origin space that becomes really interesting for him. So that I think is one part of it, is this sort of like gaining the understanding of just the story, right, from a perspective of history. But then also, as he's going through this journey, it was also about his own roots, right? Like, I mean, it's also about coming to an understanding of like, what is this journey of origin for a Black American, for an African American individual, right? Like, I think that was something that was so significant as a part of that too. So as much as you're seeing these portraits, and of course the subjects are other people, right? The subject is also him too. Yeah. Because this music affected him so much, and this, on one level, right? Just like in terms of the auditory aspect. But, it's also, this is like the narrative of Black Americans too that's on record. And so that trip was very important for those two reasons, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, because I see it too. The portraits are about whoever he's painting and whoever he's trying to think about. But it's also, yeah, as you say, it's about him and how he sees it and how he sees himself in the place of that. I'm assuming your dad listened to music when he painted?
Absolutely, like blared. So music was a necessity. Like I think like, one thing he would always say is like, you have to set the setting to conjure the spirits. So that's the other thing about his work, is that there's a shamanistic aspect to it as well, right? Where the music becomes this catalyst for this moment, for this creative moment, right? So the music was always there. It felt like there was always music in the house. It just felt like, the blues and jazz were just like, and blues rock were sort of a constant soundtrack, reggae as well. Like, all of these like diasporic musics were like really sort of a soundtrack to the setting of the studio. And I think that was another important thing about his work too, is it's not just about the sort of like quote unquote objects, right? The artworks that come out of that space, but it's really about that space of creation as well. And so the music was so quintessential to engendering that space of creation. It's filtering through that spirit of creation that you might feel in the blues or jazz, right? And then bringing that into a space so that you then, as a maker, can, conjure the work that you're trying to create.
And when you were growing up, you heard all of this stuff.
Absolutely.
Okay. Did you, as a personal thing, then when you started being able to listen to your own music, is that what you listened to, or did you totally rebel?
Well, no. I mean, I definitely listened to that as well, like, and I still do to this day. But of course, being younger person, right, millennial, like I love hip hop,
right,
and he did not. So like
he did not like hip hop.
No,
interesting.
He liked Ludacris.
Okay.
He really liked Ludacris, but other than Ludacris, no.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think he really liked Ludacris's videos.
Okay.
I think that's what it boiled down to, because Luda had great videos. But yeah, I loved hip hop. I just think he like didn't open his mind to it enough. I think there were certain artists that he was interested in. Like he also really liked Mos Def too, which kind of makes it. There's like a connection there too, because Mos Def was very close with one of his really good friends, Felipe Luciano, who's a significant figure in the jazz world as well, for being one of the founders of the Last Poets.
Yeah.
So there's that connection there. But yeah, like I think just a different generation. So like I like loved hip hop, and I would just force him to listen to it.
I just say that because I have my kids in my house, and I am playing jazz and blues all the time, and I'm going, you know what, you guys are going to rebel against this and do whatever you want, but I just want to make sure sooner, 10 years hence when you're in your 20s and stuff, you will go, God, Dad was listening to some really great stuff.
Yeah.
You'll come back around. I will set the foundation in there. So.
Well, and to that point, like, since I never was like, oh, I hate jazz. I really loved it, but I also just like really love hip hop too. Is that with that foundational knowledge, like that maybe comes from jazz or blues and other diasporic musics, like, and hip hop is such a sampling heavy, sort of genre. Like that was the cool thing, is that I could be like, oh, like I know where that's coming from.
Right.
I might like listen to Tribe Called Quest and be like, oh, like that riff right there is from Ahmad Jamal.
Right.
Like,
and then you go, wait. Ahmad Jamal came over for dinner or something. I'm assuming there was that kind of thing too. These people were running it down to your house.
Oh, that's the other aspect of it too, right? Is that I also like knew these people, right? So like went to Marsalis, for example, or even Ornette. I played pool with Ornette one time.
Ornette was a serious pool shark.
Yeah, I almost beat him, but I don't know if he was just like letting that happen. Like,
right, he might be letting
I'll
you
never
win.
know.
Kind of thing.
Like I'll never know if he was just letting that happen, but. And I kind of feel like he was, because then I think as it was getting close, he was like, "Oh, like okay, let me just."
I'm not letting this. My reputation is here, and I can't let this kid beat me, or it's going to be all over Soho.
Right. But that was the thing, is that these people to me were just like, almost like aunts and uncles, right?
Yeah.
Like they were that close, that I just kind of grew up around these people, and I think that's another important aspect of as we think through these portraits, right? Like, for many of these individuals, right, these creative communities became found family, right? Like, a lot of these individuals had to, like, leave their families, or their families might not have understood their creative direction or what have you, right? Depending on whatever situation, a lot of these people made community, and especially in Soho, is that these were artists who really, like, made community together. So that was a part of the thing, is that your family were sort of all of these artists.
Yeah. And one thing I see in the portraits is that you see them, you can view them, and I'm looking at musicians, but I'm also looking at individual human beings who make music, and you can't, I'm reminded that, like, these are actual people. They're not just they are a lot of what the
Right.
I look at one of Art Blakey, for instance. I'm
Right.
thinking, well, that is I think of his
Right.
tunes and I
Right.
think of his bands and stuff. But
Right.
then from looking at it, I also like, oh yeah, he was actually a real
Right.
a person with
Right.
feelings
Right.
and idiosyncrasies and all that. He was a
Right.
human being, and I think your dad's
Right.
portraits of that portraits that comes through a lot.
Absolutely, and a lot of what he was working from were photographs, right? And I think one interesting thing to think about is like how the photograph functions versus how the painted portrait functions. And I mean, it depends, right? It all depends on who's taking the photograph, all these things. But one of the great jazz photographers, right, is Francis Wolff. And when you look at those portraits, there is a certain level of humanism to it, right? But there is a certain level of like putting somebody on a pedestal in a sense, right? Like, you're viewing it through his lens, right? And I think that with the painting, a little bit of the difference is that you're trying to capture someone's like essence, right? A spirit. And so in that way, you end up drawing in things that are sort of human, right? Like you're drawing in what's around you. You're drawing in yourself, too, right?
Yep.
So it's part of how these two different things function. I'd say that one of the most powerful aspects of his work are like the way that he does eyes.
Yes.
They really like are striking, right? And that was the thing that was always the last thing he did, was the dot in the eye, right? That light. I forget what you call it, but it's the light in your eye that sort of gives you life or shows your life, right? So that was always the last thing that he did, and it always took him like forever. And I never got it. At the time I never got it because I was just like, it's done. Like I don't understand why are we still doing this. Like let's go home. Like I'm tired. But he's like, no. Like it takes the time that it takes. So we might leave one day and it's not done, and all that's left is that little dot. We might come back 2 weeks later and do the dot, and then it's like it's there. Right. So I think that's kind of a part of it, is that like, you're trying to bring these figures to life as opposed to capture them in the moment. I mean, that's a part of it too, but you're trying to bring the figures to life, not just capture the moment. So I think that's part of what brings the sort of like humanistic aspect to the work.
I agree. It is just about 1:15, so we are going to end this here. Do you have any questions? Okay. Figured you'd ask. And I'll say again, the Frederick Brown exhibit downstairs is going to be on view through September. Which I can never remember when these things open and close, so dates for that escape me. But it'll be around until September if anyone watching this or in the audience wants to, come by and see it or come by and see it again. So again, Bentley Brown, thank you very much for coming by and talking to us and gracing us with your presence. So.
Oh, thank you, David.